Senator Cormann.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. Mr. Acting Deputy President, the legislation before us today is a complete fraud. And the process the Senate is asked to engage in by the government today is a complete farce. This legislation is a fraud perpetuated by the Prime Minister on the Australian people. The Prime Minister is taking advantage of people's goodwill towards the environment. He wants people to believe that this legislation will help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, that this legislation is strong action on climate change, when the Prime Minister knows very well that it is nothing of the sort. The Prime Minister knows that this legislation will not help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, yet he is happy to impose significant sacrifices on people across Australia without giving them a proper explanation as to what it is that he seeks to achieve in terms of actual reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions. This process today is a farce, because we are being asked to debate a piece of legislation when we are not yet being told by the government what form this piece of legislation will be in when they ultimately want it to be passed by the end of next week. We are starting debate on a piece of legislation that we already know today will not be in the same shape by the end of next week if the government has its way. Now, today is the one-month anniversary of the government starting to engage in discussions, negotiations on a range of amendments put forward by the coalition, amendments which clearly exposed the many flaws in this legislation. The government has been negotiating for a whole month. If that was a good faith negotiation, the government would have been telling the Australian people and the coalition by now which amendments they can agree with and which ones they can't, so that we could have, and the Senate could have, a proper debate about the merits of the final shape that this legislation is in. Instead, we're having here a debate about a piece of legislation that universally everybody in the Senate other than the Labor Party agrees is deeply flawed. And we know that the legislation that ultimately is going to be put to a vote if the government has its way is going to be in a totally different shape. So the government is not conducting this process in good faith. It is certainly not acting in good faith with the Senate. Now, Mr. Acting Deputy President, this emissions trading scheme legislation is not strong action on climate change. It will not help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. In the absence of an appropriately comprehensive global agreement, this emissions trading scheme will push up the cost of everything, it will cost jobs, it will put pressure on the economy, it will put our energy security at risk, it will have a particularly bad impact on regional Australia, and yet it will do nothing to help reduce emissions. Why is that a good idea, I would ask? Now, let's just reflect on what is being proposed. The government is proposing to impose a price on carbon, which is supposed to change behaviours. Now, an emissions trading scheme could be an effective way of helping to reduce emissions globally. An emissions trading scheme in Australia could be an effective part of it if it was part of an appropriately comprehensive global scheme. And indeed, when the Howard government announced an emissions trading scheme, and even when the Rudd government first went to the process of developing an emissions trading scheme, it was always based on the assumption that it would be part of an appropriately comprehensive global scheme. But of course, we now know that this is very far from being a reality moving forward. In fact, it is highly unlikely that this will be a reality moving forward, and surely then we need to reassess whether this really is the best way in which Australia can help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. The real concern I have with the Prime Minister's approach, he has got the typical bureaucrat's approach. Our chief bureaucrat here in Canberra, he wants to tick the box. Australian people, you're concerned about the environment, you're concerned about climate change, I've got the solution for you. ETS, tick, done. Irrespective of whether it's actually going to make a difference, because this is actually going to make it worse. If we are going to do something that is ineffective and make people believe that we've actually fixed the problem. We're actually going to end up in a worse situation than where we started. Now, what is the actual problem? I mean, we are part of a global trade environment. If we impose costs on businesses in Australia that are not faced by our competitors in other countries around the world, this will have an impact on our international trade competitiveness. If we reduce emissions in Australia in a way that will result in increased emissions in other parts of the world, we have done nothing. We've done nothing for the global environment. If we make overseas polluters more competitive than even the most environmentally friendly equivalent business in Australia, we have done nothing to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. If emissions overseas increase by more than we can reduce them in Australia through this ETS as a direct result of the way this ETS is structured, we have done nothing to address climate change, we have done nothing to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, but we have imposed significant sacrifices on people right around Australia, and sacrifices which the Prime Minister to this day has not explained to the Australian people, and of course he hasn't explained the benefit either. Now, I might just say, I was the chair of the Senate Fuel and Energy Committee, and we had a whole series of departmental officials in front of us providing explanations about what the emissions trading scheme would and wouldn't do. And I asked the question of a senior official of the Department of Climate Change and Water. And the question was very simply this: what is the target in terms of a net reduction in global emissions to flow from the proposed Australian emissions trading scheme? The official wasn't able to answer. And of course he wasn't able to answer, and some say, well, that's an unfair question because he couldn't possibly know, because it depends on what happens in other parts of the world. Exactly. It depends on what happens in other parts of the world. Now, I've actually, in the report that the Fuel and Energy Committee put out, we made this counterintuitive observation. If we are really serious about reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, and if that is our target, if that is our objective, it might well be in the best interest of the world for Australia to increase emissions in certain areas if it helps to reduce emissions by more in the world overall. And I'll explain. I mean, if we want to expand our LNG industry in Australia, we will increase emissions. But for every tonne of additional emissions producing LNG in Australia, we will be able to reduce emissions in China by 5.5 to 9 tonnes if that LNG displaces coal. We'll be able to reduce emissions by 4 tonnes if it displaces coal in Japan. That is a net positive effect for the world environment. Australia should be having a debate on how we as a nation can best contribute to a reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions. We should not be having a debate about an ETS as an end in itself. The ETS was only ever seen as a tool, an instrument that could help us achieve a particular objective. And if the global circumstances change, we have to be adult and mature enough to say, okay, let's reassess. Let's remind ourselves what it is that we're actually trying to achieve. And then let's see whether there might be better ways in which we can help achieve our actual objective. Now, much has been made about the argument that the coalition took an emissions trading scheme to the last election, and we did. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But since then, a lot has changed. Firstly, we've had the Garneau review, we've had the Green Paper, the Treasury modelling, the White Paper. We've had 5 Senate inquiries. We have a much better understanding now about what an emissions trading scheme can and cannot achieve, in particular in the absence of an appropriately comprehensive global agreement. A much better understanding. And of course the assumption was that the Australian ETS would be part of an appropriately comprehensive global scheme, which is much less likely now. And furthermore, the objectives for Copenhagen were set after the 2007 election. We had the Bali conference in December 2007. Penny Wong's, the Senator Wong's first foray onto the international stage. That's when they set the objectives for Copenhagen. And we know that in Copenhagen, countries from around the world were supposed to commit, well, developed nations from around the world were supposed to commit to emissions reduction targets. And even the Prime Minister now is conceding that that's not going to happen. So should we just press ahead no matter what? No matter what it means in terms of reducing emissions around the world, no matter what it means for jobs, for the cost of living, for energy security? That would just be completely irresponsible. And I'd just like to note here, I mean, the government likes to simplify this debate into a debate between climate change believers and climate change skeptics. I think that is a completely simplistic way of handling the debate. Because the government actually had its own doubts a little while ago, and let's just reflect on this. I mean, when Kevin Rudd was elected to government, first up he said, oh, well, we've got to take urgent action. This is the highest moral challenge of this century, and if those that don't agree to take urgent action, which equals ETS, are climate change deniers, climate change skeptics. He was into the name calling. But then, of course, in February this year, I'll just remind the Senate that it was the government. It was the government. It was Wayne Swan as the Treasurer who commissioned a new inquiry into the choice of emissions trading. On the 12th of February, a new inquiry into the choice of emissions trading. It was to be chaired by Mr. Craig Thomson MP, the chair of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Economics. And I'll just remind the Senate of the terms of reference. This is in February, after Green Paper, after Treasury modelling, after White Paper, after the draft legislation was put out there. And the committee was to inquire into the choice of emissions trading as a central policy to reduce Australia's carbon pollution, taking into account the need to A, reduce carbon pollution at the lowest economic cost, B, put in place long-term incentives for investment in clean energy and low-emission technology, and C, contribute to a global solution to climate change. What a sensible set of terms of reference. Except, you know what happened? A week later, this inquiry was cancelled by the Rudd government. A week later, the inquiry was cancelled. And the reason it would have been cancelled is because there would have been a battle going on inside the Rudd cabinet between those that thought, well, hang on, let's just see whether this is really the most sensible way to go, and those that were blindly following ideology, who had committed themselves to an ETS as an end in itself, who had lost sight of what it is that we actually were trying to achieve, and thought that it would be a loss of face to question the choice of an ETS as the way forward at this late stage. And then, of course, on the 4th of May, Penny Wong, Minister Wong, and the Prime Minister announced, they made an extraordinary announcement. They announced to delay the implementation of an emissions trading scheme by 12 months. If anybody else had put that forward only a little while earlier, they would have been accused of being climate change deniers, climate change skeptics. They would have been called all sorts of names. But of course, that's exactly what the government did. Now, the Senate, I also draw to the attention of the Senate the secrecy with which the government has been handling all of this. Important information around the economic modelling conducted by Treasury has been kept secret. The Senate has used all of its powers and all of the procedures available to it to force the government to release significant information related to the economic modelling into the CPRS. The government to this day has refused on very weak grounds. And of course we had the Morgan Stanley report, which was commissioned by the government, about the impact on the electricity generators, which the government to this day is keeping secret. Now, I just remind the Senate that the Rudd government, in its economic modelling about the impact of the CPRS, incredibly assumed that there would be a seamless transition from a high carbon to a low carbon electricity generating economy, which is of course completely not an appropriate assumption to make. But I also just remind the Senate of the controversy in the lead up to the last election, when Peter Garrett came out and said, well, yes, Australia might go it alone. Australia might commit to targets even though China and India might not come on board. Remember that? The Prime Minister had to essentially pull Peter Garrett back into line, and then, of course, Peter Garrett was subsequently demoted. And I just quote here from The Australian on the 30th of October 2007, where it says that Peter Garrett's political credentials were in tatters last night after Kevin Rudd forced his environment spokesman to issue a humiliating clarification of Labor's greenhouse gas policy. Now, and at the core of that argument was that, of course, any Australian ETS needed to be part of a comprehensive global scheme in order to achieve its intended objectives, which is to help contribute to a reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions. And I mean, in the Treasury modelling, this is quite incredible. The Treasury modelling, which is there to assess the impact on our economy, on jobs, etc., assumes that the US would have a scheme in place by 2010, that China and wealthier, the sort of richer developing countries would have a scheme in place by 2015, and that India would have a scheme in place by 2020. Now, that's not going to happen. Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister, knows it's not going to happen. Everybody knows it's not going to happen. So isn't it then in the national interest for us to reassess whether the way forward is the most appropriate way forward? Of course it is. Now, I've argued publicly, and my views are well and truly on the record. I don't think that we should be finalising this legislation before Copenhagen and before we know what the rest of the world is prepared to do in relation to emissions trading, in particular the US. And the reason for that is because if we go ahead and with a scheme that is not in sync with the rest of the world, it is going to have bad impacts on our economy as well as ensuring that there won't be any environmental benefits. Now, Copenhagen is 3 weeks away. The start of the Copenhagen conference is 3 weeks away. The Prime Minister and Minister Wong themselves have already delayed the implementation of this scheme by 12 months. They've delayed reintroducing this legislation into the Senate by 3 months for their own political reasons. Why is it then not in the national interest for us to wait another 3 weeks to find out what comes out of Copenhagen so we can make a sensible decision in the national interest early in the new year about the best way forward, in terms of Australia maximising our contribution to the world in terms of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions and doing it in an economically responsible fashion. Now, if the government was serious, of course, about wanting to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, there's a whole range of things that they could do, things that would have a net beneficial effect in terms of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, previous speakers have already mentioned, if we were serious, we would go down the nuclear path. Countries around the world, the UK has just announced 10 more nuclear power stations. China, the president of China, when he spoke on climate change before the United Nations a few weeks ago, outlined a series of strategies: renewables, more trees, and nuclear. Countries around Europe that previously had been reluctant about nuclear are all going down the nuclear path because they recognise that nuclear has to be part of the solution if we want to responsibly achieve dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in a way that doesn't compromise our economic prosperity and our energy security moving forward. Now, if the Prime Minister was serious about climate change, and if the Prime Minister was serious about reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, he would show some leadership towards his Labor state governments and the Labor state opposition in Western Australia, who to this day have backward, old-fashioned policies in relation to uranium mining. Australia has got 40% of the world's known resources of uranium. One of the very effective strategies would be for Australia to expand our uranium exports and to, essentially help supply nuclear power stations around the world, who would displace coal-fired power and energy. Why is the Prime Minister not calling on the state premiers around Australia who are resisting this? Why is the Premier not picking up the phone to the Leader of the Opposition in Western Australia? Mr. Acting Deputy President, I'm about to run out of time, but the short the short point that I want to make is that this legislation is a fraud. Prime Minister Rudd is performing a complete con on the Australian people. He's taking advantage of people's goodwill towards the environment. He's wanting to make people believe that this will be effective in helping to reduce emissions when he knows that this is not true. This is going to be bad for the economy and bad for the environment.
Order, Senator Cormann. Your time has expired.